Hello and welcome. Living with your adult child, co-purchasing property with a friend, or building an extension or granny flat with family. These common arrangements often involve an older person exchanging their property or assets in return for housing or for care as they age. This webinar is designed to help you learn more about why and whether you should establish a family agreement. I'm Philippa McDonald, and it's my pleasure to be with you for the next hour for this important discussion. Before we go any further, we acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to our elders, past, present, and emerging. This webinar on family agreements is brought to you by Compass and Elder Abuse Action Australia project. Compass is committed to ensuring equitable and inclusive responses to end elder abuse for people with diverse characteristics and life experiences. Now, a legal disclaimer. Please be aware that laws vary from state to state and between territories. The information provided in this webinar is not a substitute for individual legal advice. Our key objectives today are to find out what a family agreement is and why you might need one, to learn more about what a family agreement should include, to discover the steps to making a family agreement, to get advice on what to do when things go wrong, and to learn more about gifting money or property to a family member or another person, or moving house, and how it can affect the amount of age pension a person receives. I encourage you to ask questions in the chat box, and we will endeavour to get to them. I ask you to be respectful and to not, under any circumstances, to name or identify people. Now, these conversations are not easy. The issues raised in this webinar could cause distress to some of you, so a couple of tips. You don't have to soldier on. We are recording this webinar and you can come back and watch it in your own time. There is an elder helpline, 1-800-ELDER-HELP. That's 1-800-353-374. 1-800-353-374. Now let's meet our hugely knowledgeable panelists. Professor Eileen Webb is a Professor of Law and Ageing in the School of Law at the University of South Australia. Eileen's scholarly research focuses on ageing and the law, elder law, and the human rights of older people. Her research recently has focused on older people's rights to housing, including security of tenure for older people and how the operation of existing laws may make older people susceptible to financial exploitation and housing vulnerability. Welcome, Professor Eileen Webb. Dr. Rachel Carson is coming to us from Melbourne. She's a socio-legal researcher with expertise in family law and qualitative research about family law disputes. Rachel is a senior research fellow and executive manager team lead of the family law, family violence and elder abuse research team at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. She has 20 years experience researching the Australian family law system, coming to us from Melbourne. And also from Melbourne, we're joined by Melanie Yostin. Melanie is a social worker and writer who has worked in the areas of ageing, social policy, and elder abuse for the last 10 years at Senior Rights Victoria and the National Ageing Research Institute. She's the author of a book, A Long Time Coming, Essays on Old Age. Now, let's kick off. Remember the chat. We want your questions. Melanie, What is a family agreement and why might you need one?
So a family agreement is an arrangement between an older person and someone else regarding care and living arrangements. So sometimes it's called an assets for care agreement, and it will usually involve the older person exchanging property or assets in return for somewhere to live and care as they age. So the agreement should be mutually beneficial. For the older person, it might mean they don't have to live alone as they age. They might be closer to grandchildren. They might be avoiding moving into residential care earlier than they might wish to. For the family member, who's usually the adult child of the older person, but sometimes someone else, the benefits might be a financial boost, remaining close to their parent and peace of mind related to that, and having help with childcare and household work as well. So it can look like an older person selling their home and buying a new one with the adult child, or building an extension or granny flat. Or sometimes it can just be a loan or a gift linked to an understanding that this might be an advance on inheritance. And you asked why you might need one. It's very important because things can go wrong. Basically, if you have this agreement, it's usually verbal and informal, and it's family, so you think everything will be okay. But sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes people become ill, people pass away, either party could pass away unexpectedly, relationships can break down, marriages, particularly of your adult child or someone else, might break down, people might need to move interstate for work, people might not do what they promised. Also, grandchildren grow up and might not need your care, family dynamics change. There's a lot of things that can change. If you've got a family agreement that has been formalised by being documented and is in writing, you've got a much better chance of following up some of the legal and civil options that are available for resolving the dispute, which might include perhaps trying to get back money that you put into the arrangement, or trying to move on with your life and be able to resolve it.
Look, thanks for that, Melanie. And now to you, Professor Eileen Webb, how might someone approach a family agreement if you think that this might be the way to go?
Well, it can be a difficult thing to do because often these sorts of arrangements arise during maybe a period of family crisis. Somebody has been diagnosed with an illness, or there's choices having to be made about care and so on. So they can tend to be often entered into quite informally, as Melanie mentioned, and indeed quickly, without thinking through the consequences and the many things that can potentially go wrong through no fault of the family, just through everyday life with breakdowns and so on. I would say this, of course, and I'm sure you're going to ask me this, Philippa, but I would suggest seeing a lawyer about this, not because I'm trying to drum up trade for my profession, but simply because there are so many contingencies in relation to these arrangements, and such a variety of arrangements, as Melanie pointed out. It can be the sale of a house, it can be simply moving in, it can be putting up a granny flat, it can be a variety of different arrangements which need to be structured in a particular and a careful way.
Well, you've given us a little bit of an idea, but what should you expect if you go to a lawyer, and what should you have with you? You've got to come prepared.
Okay, now look, absolutely. And the thing that I really wanted to emphasise here is that even though we don't want to fall foul of relationships with our family, a person entering into one of these arrangements has to realise it's not a small family matter. It will often involve a significant transfer of assets that can have financial and housing ramifications for the rest of that person's life if it does go wrong. And because so many of these arrangements are informal, so either there's an informal arrangement or there's a lack of competent legal advice. There's the failure to predict and plan for these contingencies. So when you go to the lawyer, the first thing is schedule a meeting, and I'm doing this 1, 2, 3 because of time. Firstly, if I can just say summary, get it in writing. And if you can, get on the title to the property, if that's appropriate to your transaction. They're my 2 takeaways. But schedule an appointment without the family member there. The solicitor is acting for you, and they will look after your best interests. If you do need support, so for example, in relation to an interpreter, or if you're a little bit hard of hearing, or you just want somebody with you, take somebody who is removed from that immediate family situation and who you're going to be dealing with. Don't be concerned if a lawyer initially looks at, asks for questions that could be assessing things like capacity or the possibility of undue influence. That is simply the solicitor doing their job. And quite frankly, if I can say this, not enough solicitors are actually doing this at the moment. Ask to go on the title, discuss all the options and contingencies. So not just if there's a breakdown, but what if somebody gets sick? What if somebody goes bankrupt? What's going to be permitted? And then go away and think about it if you can, and really let it, get that letter of advice and let it settle in, and then decide what is the best for you. You're not being selfish. You're protecting your own interests and those of your family.
Exactly. There's so much at stake, but this has to be something you do separately from your son or your daughter or the other party who stands to benefit from this arrangement.
Yeah, that's right.
And well, Dr. Rachel Carson, what's the evidence? I mean, who usually kicks off or organises a family agreement? Where does the impetus often come from?
Well, look, we have some insight from our National Elder Abuse Prevalence Study from the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and I've got a couple of slides that might help us to work our way through this. And if we can go to the third slide, we'll see from this slide when it comes on the screen that they're actually really not very common. Only 3% of the participants in our survey, which was a representative sample of 7,000 community dwelling people aged 65 and older, only 3% of those people reported that they had a family agreement. And these findings are quite in contrast to those reports of those who had a will. So 88% of people who participated in the survey reported having a will, and a lower but still a majority of proportion of people had an enduring power of attorney. That was 52%. So only 3% having that agreement in place. And as alluded to, only under 2/3 of these people actually had the agreement in writing. And now, if we take a look on the screen, we can see that as people age, they're more likely to enter into these agreements. So you can see that at the ages between, say, 70 and 79 years, there's 3% of people who reported having this agreement. 80 to 84 years, it was 4%. It went up to 7% for people who were in the 85 plus age bracket. What our data also showed was that in contrast to people who had wills and powers of attorney, older people from a called background, so a culturally and linguistically diverse background, were more likely to report having a family agreement. Older people who were either never married or who had been widowed were more likely to report having an agreement. And people from relatively socioeconomically disadvantaged areas were also more likely to report having a family agreement. In terms of who older people make these agreements with, older people, as we can see on the screen, most commonly reported making these agreements with their children. So 41% of people who reported having a family agreement made those agreements with their children. And older people also reported making these family agreements with professional carers, with their spouse or their partner. And family agreements were also made with siblings to a lesser degree, and to friends and other family members. So those are the sorts of people who are making these agreements.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you. And now I'm just going to pick up from there from one of the questions in the Q&A, and it might be a little too specific for us at the moment, but let's give it a crack. If the person transferring the asset, this might be for you, Professor Webb, if the person transferring the asset is on the title, this invalidates specific granny flat treatment from Centrelink, and the perspective is the person is simply a part owner of the asset, I beg your pardon.
Oh yeah, and I've typed a quick little answer in response in the chat box, because we will be looking at the Centrelink issues. But no, look, that is a very good point, and I mean, and it demonstrates that in this area there are so many conflicting issues. So, for example, if somebody wants to maintain their centre, with granny flat interest under Centrelink, obviously we understand that, but the fact of the matter is, you are not, like, if the older person isn't on the title, that can be extremely problematic as well. So you've got all these competing interests in relation to, yes, we want to maintain our Centrelink, we don't want to be on the title, but speaking as a former property lawyer, obviously being on the title is one of the strongest interests that you have. I don't want to get too technical here, Philippa, but very quickly, I mean, there's also these arguments about, well, okay, well, could the person not become registered, but lodge a caveat over the property? But that comes with its own problems in itself, which we haven't got time to deal with. So there's so many conflicting issues here, and they don't necessarily play out for the benefit of the older person.
Exactly. And if you're going to a lawyer, you want a lawyer with some specialist knowledge of this area of law.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think this one might come back to you, Rachel, and that is, are we seeing family agreements, just from the evidence that you've shown us, family agreements being made with service providers?
Yes, so there was a small proportion that were made with service providers. Unfortunately, we don't have from the survey data an understanding as to the nature of those agreements, but it may be that it is a professional providing a caring responsibility, and in return for that, there is an agreement to recompense for that, and it might be by way of an asset transfer. So it's unclear on the face of the data from the survey as to the exact nature of these types of agreements. We'd have to do a little bit more research to understand that in more detail. But essentially, yes, there were some older people who did say that they made these agreements with somebody who was providing them with a service. So service provider used in that context.
So just to recap, it's more your family, your children, who are likely to try and instigate a family agreement, but there are a lot more players in the field than you might think. It's a complex picture.
Well, that's right. And so although service providers were listed as 13% of the family agreements that were made were with service providers, and that we use that term quite loosely. It could be quite an informal arrangement, but yes, by and large, older people were making family agreements with either their biological or adopted children, and it was nearly 50% of the agreements. So 41% of those agreements were made with parties' children.
I don't want to get bogged down here, but service providers could include who?
It could be somebody who comes into the home and provides care within the home. It might be somebody who maintains the property of the older person. It could be a range of care that's provided in that context. I guess in terms of using that term, we're thinking of somebody who's not related in a way in any way to the party, but they're providing a service to the older person.
Thank you. And Melanie, how does someone get a family agreement made?
Yeah, so as Eileen has mentioned, ultimately what your aim is to go and see a lawyer and get them to draw that up. But there's quite a few steps before that. And I can see in the Q&A someone's asked a question about are these agreements legal in every state, and do states vary on things you can and can't put in them? And Eileen might be able to speak to this more specifically, but essentially it's not like an enduring power of attorney or something like that where there's a particular document to be filled out. There's not sort of a standardized agreement. So it will be up to the lawyer and up to what the situation is and what's being transferred and things like that. So your lawyer will be able to direct exactly what the agreement will look like. And there are some examples available. But before you get to that point of visiting a lawyer, one of the most important things you need to do is just think yourself. Think about what you want, whether this is the right way to go about it, whether you're being pressured by a family who might have like good intentions and they might want you to feel safe and they might want to keep you close. But just think about, is this the only option? Are there other things? What might I be giving up if I enter a family agreement in terms of, independence, in terms of assets and property and potential future? You might be living for many more decades to come, and thinking about how you're going to pay for that and what might happen if the agreement breaks down. So it's good then, after you've thought about yourself and sort of listed some pros and cons, go and discuss it with family and friends. So with the person that you'll be entering the agreement with, but with other family members as well, and other friends for their perspective. Particularly, if you're going to be moving in with one son or daughter, the others will be interested to know what the assets that might be being passed over, or any property, things like that. It's much better for these things to be kind of transparent and open and discussed, rather than people finding out later and might be feeding into family feuds and those sorts of difficulties. So it really is a good idea to discuss it. And also with your friends, like other people might be considering this, and it's good to discuss and get different perspectives. And then the third thing you should do is to go and get legal and financial advice. So this is separate, not the same as getting the agreement drawn up, but discussing with a financial advisor or with a lawyer about what will this mean for yourself now and in the future. What tax implications will it have? What implications will it have for Centrelink, for the pension, for paying for aged care? Anything like that. What might it mean for your borrowing power? Things like that, if you're giving up property and assets. So you want to find out what it means for you, and what options will you have if things go wrong or if it doesn't work out. So how do you step away from it? What are the different options? And one of the reasons this is really important is I can see in the chat that Gary Ferguson has asked about how in Australia families trust each other instinctively, and it can be really tricky then to say to family, oh, well, we need to get this formalized and things, because they think, well, why don't you trust me? But having these discussions and going to see a lawyer or financial advisor, you can kind of put it away from yourself. You can say, well, the financial advisor said I had to do this. In the same way that you don't buy a house or a car just by a shake of the hand, you have a contract, you sign things. You can kind of put it onto the authorities and say, well, the bank told me this, the financial advisor told me, the lawyer said, it's about protecting all of us. It's just the standard thing that's done. We just have to jump through these hoops. Also, Centrelink told me, no one really likes to have an argument with Centrelink. And on that note, it is Centrelink do run the financial information service, where you can call up and ask people there for financial advice and how things will affect your pension, tax, those sorts of things. So they can give you really good advice on that. That's a free service.
Yeah, that's a great resource. Well, let's talk. I mean, there is trust, or she'll be right, Mum. She'll be right, Dad. And you look at the Compass website and you see some of the disastrous situations which are based on factual stories, that, people losing their homes and just ending up in the most vulnerable situations and not having the care they need into their older age, when, 5 years beforehand, they were really quite comfortably off and secure. So who would like to talk about the risks? Rachel, is this something that you can talk about? And if any, you, Melanie, or Eileen would like to come in on that, the risks.
Well, look, there are a range of concerns that have been raised about family agreements, including by the Australian Law Reform Commission when they reviewed this space more generally in the context of elder abuse. In particular, concerns are that there can, as Melanie and Eileen have indicated, there can be some really serious consequences for an older person if the promise for that ongoing care isn't fulfilled, or where the relationship, for another reason, breaks down. Concerns have been raised in relation to family agreements as potentially being an enabler of elder abuse, particularly where there are informal agreements and where decisions haven't been made with the appropriate legal and financial advice. While formalising a family agreement can operate as a protective mechanism, it can't remove all of the risks associated with entering into a family agreement or an assets for care arrangement. So it's really crucial for an older person to obtain that early and independent legal and financial advice, as we've been talking about a moment ago. This can really support the provision of clearer and more timely explanations about the risks to your particular circumstances and the potential consequences for your individual circumstances for entering into a family agreement. Another aspect might perhaps be, having social workers on side that can support older people to understand what the risks are and to give greater consideration to the detail in the agreement and to the nature and level of care to be provided and the mechanisms that should be put in place to deal with potential changes to the older person or the family members or other parties with whom the agreement is made, their circumstances as well. So really important to not rush in, as we were talking about, and to consider the potential risks in your individual circumstances. But somebody else might also have another.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So I'll come to you, Melanie. Just how family agreements can relate to elder abuse. Let's talk about that fine line.
Yeah, and it is a fine line. Rachel sort of identified some of the places where family agreements can be used to enable that elder abuse, which, is very disappointing, but unfortunately, sometimes people will find a way. And I guess elder abuse can take many forms. So you might have a family agreement that was entered into with good intentions. Everyone had every hope that it would work and it would provide what all the parties wanted. But then things change. As we mentioned before, people might need more care than originally thought. There also might be by financial difficulties. People can lose jobs or there can be other things that happen. So it might not be anyone's intention, but there might be some difficulties. Then that's not necessarily abuse. It might become abusive when the older person tries to exit the family agreement or tries to take back the money that they put into it, and family tensions and conflict can rise. And it's a really difficult situation for an older person to be in, because if it's their children and potentially grandchildren that they're trying to take this money or property back from, or trying to save themselves, there's a lot of emotion. It can be a really difficult situation. On the other hand, we also have situations where someone might have deliberately entered the agreement with the intention of getting their hands on mum and dad's property or money, or with absolutely no intention of providing the care. So it can be really sad when you can see situations where an older person has signed over their house in the promise for care and then ends up being neglected. And perhaps, particularly if they've got a cognitive impairment and are unable to look after themselves, it can become quite severe neglect and abuse. Another situation that sometimes arises is that the adult children that the older person might be living with might become themselves a victim or a perpetrator of family violence, within their marriage or their family. And the older person can be on the receiving end of that, be a witness to that, or be involved in that scenario, might need to leave that house that was supposed to be where they live out the rest of their days, but it's become, a violent or abusive situation. So these are all the reasons why a person needs to think really carefully about what their other options are and what are the options for leaving the agreement if things go wrong that no one intended to go wrong.
Well, it sounds like a question for Eileen Webb. Dispute resolution. Can family agreements be revoked if breached? What can you do? What happens when you've already transferred the assets?
It's a legal minefield, Philippa. In relation to if you actually have an arrangement, it's a contract, so the usual rules in relation to the termination of contract will apply. So in relation, if there's a breach of contract, the problem I just want to stress at the moment is these are relatively new sorts of agreements. So, establishing a breach in itself could be a nightmare, but breach, if there's a trigger of a contractual termination clause, if that's been built in, and usual things like frustration, misrepresentation, or indeed mutual agreement, it's not working, let's just all walk away. I suppose the point I'd really like to emphasise is again, sadly, most of these transactions are not in contractual form. And as Rachel mentioned, the Australian Law Reform Commission looked closely at family agreements in their 2017 in their 2017 report. But the bottom line is this: if the older person has not got a contract and they're trying to get their money back, the usual situation will be they will have to proceed through a superior court. So, for example, if you were arguing something like undue influence, a failed joint venture, various duress. There's a variety of things which I'm quite happy to elaborate on in the chat. But what you're going to find, what you will need to do is you have to go to a superior court. That means time, that means a lot of money, and that means a huge amount of stress when you're dealing with your family. Now, I'd just like to give a shout out, if I can, to my colleague at UTS, Teresa Soames, who's doing incredible work in this area. And one of the things which she is looking at is bringing considerations of assets for care, family arrangements into the tribunals. So there's a quicker, cheaper, more informal way of actually dealing with their transactions, these transactions when they go wrong, plus opportunities for on-site mediation, and they're already set up with guardianship administration and so on, so they're familiar with dealing with older clients. If I can, I suppose I keep trying to sort of nail these points, but basically, if I really feel that we need to look very, very seriously in each of the states of bringing jurisdiction for these matters into the tribunals and making it quicker, easier, and more accessible to older people when these things go wrong.
I mean, just when you think of the waiting times for the higher courts too, that you could be waiting a year, 18 months for a hearing, then it's just not sustainable for something which could be an urgent need. I'm just going to bring one of the chats in. I've got an older person who lives in a granny flat on a property which is officially owned by their daughter, claim a Centrelink benefit, currently looking for work after taking out superannuation to help purchase the property that has the daughter's name on the title, not that person's. Can they claim New Start, Job Seeker, or benefit from Centrelink? What are the options? It sounds like there's a degree of hardship there from that action to help a daughter.
Yeah, and I would say that with that, I mean, it's very difficult to speak specifically, but the best step is to contact the Financial Information Service at Centrelink and let them know what your situation is, what your finances are, and they will be able to make that assessment and give you the advice as to whether you can claim a Centrelink benefit or not, and how the property and your assets will affect that.
Thank you. And look, saying no, no one likes to say no, especially to family. We go above and beyond for family. It's they're our blood. What do you do when you want to say no? How can you say no? And who can stand up for you? Rachel, I'm going to give that a crack.
Absolutely. Look, it is a challenge. I don't underestimate the challenge dealing with loved ones. We've spoken a bit throughout this discussion, we've spoken about the importance of getting legal and financial advice. Having that opportunity, as we talked about before, to be able to say, oh, well, the lawyer has indicated that, blah, 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 and unfortunately I'm not able to do it as much as I'd like. I can't do it. If referring to the advice that you've had in that context isn't sufficient, perhaps garnering support from that professional to help you deliver that message. Alternatively, there might be an advocacy agency that you could turn to help you communicate with your loved one, or another service provider that you're comfortable with, or a social worker that you have an established relationship, or indeed a trusted family or friend that can help you communicate that with the person who wishes to instigate the agreement and with whom you don't wish to enter the agreement. But
that's right. So it's to separate it from being the personal, that it's based on professional advice, and it's in the interests of both parties.
Well, that's right. That's right. And to take the personal out of it and to communicate in a clear way, and hopefully to reduce the potential for repercussions as a result of indicating that that you don't wish to engage in the agreement.
So when you talk about an advocacy, someone who could do that advocacy for you, given some examples, but is there anyone else that we mightn't have thought of that you could turn to help you out in a situation like that when you talked about advocacy?
Well, sorry, Rachel, I'll just jump
Okay.
in and say a really great place to go is the Elder Helpline, because that will put you through to the service in your state that knows the most about it. And they will have either advocates on board or can direct you to someone to speak to. So they have heard many people talk about this. Like, you might feel that you're the only person that this is happening to and no one's ever had to have this discussion before, but they have heard it all before, and they will have heard the different arguments that family members can give, or the things that people can say. And so they will be able to give you really good advice on how to have those conversations and what to do next.
And I know a lot of our participants have pen and paper at hand, or they might be putting their notes into their mobile phones. So that Elder Helpline is 1800 353 374. That's 1800 353 374. Now, wow, we're just really ripping through the questions. So much information. We'll go back to the chat in a moment. And look, Eileen, look, these are all such difficult conversations to have. Why don't things always go to plan, even when your kids, and we've touched on this, even when your kids have your best interests at heart?
Look, the thing with it, Philippa, is so often when we think of these arrangements, it's sort of like, oh, well, everybody's not getting on, and it all just becomes horrible, and the older person doesn't want to live there anymore, etc. But the fact of the matter is, it's yes, that happens, but often it is just the vagaries of everyday life. So, bankruptcies, the adult child's marriage breaks down, somebody is injured or becomes ill. One of the a matter I'm dealing with at the moment is that one of the children has become has become ill, and it's not a case of, oh, everybody's just being horrible. And I'd just like to sort of hark back to Melanie's earlier point. It's not just a case of people not necessarily, and these things are very difficult to anticipate. I'm sorry, I guess that's what I was trying to say. So, even when you have an agreement, you might think it's almost like a watertight, you've covered every contingency. Sometimes these other things just creep up on us because life, and it's a tragedy when it happens, but these things can go wrong for a variety of reasons. It's not just the people are bad people and can't get on. Things can just get in the way, and that's why it's so important to consider contingencies.
Yes, and we've got lots of questions here too. Like, you can have someone lose a job, the spouse of your son or daughter lose a job, and then things get really hard, and you don't want to take the kids out of maybe a particular school, and and money can be spent very, very quickly to get into a position of hardship without thinking of that person in the granny flat. I've certainly witnessed that. I've got a question of, how often does the older person instigate a family agreement? And what would be the reasons in doing so? Who'd like to tackle that?
Well, I might just jump in there, if that's okay, Philippa.
Thanks, Rachel.
I just wanted to make it clear that the figures that I was reading out before are who's actually entering into the agreement. Unfortunately, we don't have data on who's actually instigating them. So while we know the parties with whom the older people are making those agreements, we don't know who's instigating them. But I imagine from understanding the material in this area, that it might be that the children involved in the agreement are instigating, or the other parties to the agreement are instigating because they wish to provide for the older person in their lives, or it might be that the older person instigates. But in terms of proportions, unfortunately, we don't have that data at the moment.
Well, let's let's ask, what would be 2 good reasons for instigating your own family agreement if you're an older person?
Well, many older people want to be able to share the wealth that they've built up with their family in a way before they die. So lots of people might think, I have this money, I can see that my children are struggling to get into the housing market, and this is a way that we could do this together. Together we could buy a property that neither of us could have a loan, or I'm living in this very large family home that is hard to upkeep. So it's time for me to either have the family move in with me, but I want to be sure that I can stay here too, or that it's time to sell that home and buy something else that's more suitable. So there are a couple of the reasons that an older person might choose to do that, usually to help out family members. And I just want to point out too, Gary mentioned in the chat that a lot of these arrangements work out really well. Like, we're obviously talking about some of the terrible things that can happen, but sometimes people do think through the options, they look at what's available, and it works. You know, it's the best thing for everyone, and it's a way of people living together or having that codependence on one another to help them live the lives they want to. So it can work out really well.
Could I just add just quickly to
Yes.
Philippa, just on Gary's point, look, absolutely. And I mean, I'm sorry if I'm the miserable lawyer on the panel making, you know, everybody feel bad. Just this is what we get when it gets to us. So these are the ones that we see. But yes, they do, and they can work out very well. And just touching on Melanie's point, you know, two things here at the moment in Australia: housing affordability, and you know, a quite understandable apprehension about going into care. And so these arrangements, when they work out, and you know, the prospect of these arrangements are very, very attractive. And I think if we just all work together to make people more aware and try to cover everybody's interests, I think they could be they'll be an excellent arrangement moving forward.
Well, this is a good segue to Melanie. Melanie, can you gift money to children before you qualify for the pension without it affecting your eligibility?
You can, but there are rules. So any gifts that a person makes within the preceding 5 years of applying for the pension, that would count in their assets and income tests. But you can give up to $30,000 over that 5-year period without it affecting your kind of how much pension you'll receive or how much you'll be assessed as needing to pay for aged care. So so you can't go and give away $1 million and then apply for the pension the next day. They will understandably not be very happy about that. But that is a question to ask the Financial Information Service at Centrelink. And just to point out that service is separate to Centrelink, so that's not looking at your individual. It's not like they're going to be taking notes and being like, oh, hang on, well, I'll put this little sneaky note in your file again when you do come to apply for the pension. It's kind of a separate independent service where they can give sort of a bit more general advice, but quite specific. So you can ask those questions of, I want to give my daughter $50,000, but I might need the pension in about 5 years. Should I do it now? Should I wait? Also, financial advisors are very good on that information.
And Jenny Blakey has been putting a few details in the chat as well, which could be helpful. So thank you very much. So look, this is a little bit different, but I think it's one of those elephant in the room topics or challenges. I have an adult child living at home. How can I get them to leave? Melanie.
Look, there is no easy way if it's come to the situation where you would like your adult child to leave. And it will depend on your individual circumstance and what that relationship is, why the child is there, all of those things. And it can also depend on the jurisdiction you're living in. Some places, if a child has been paying money to stay there, that's seen as rent and they can perhaps be treated like a tenant. It might also depend on the behaviour of that child. So first up, you know, you would need to ask them directly to leave. Sometimes people are afraid of even taking that first step, which is understandable. So you might want a friend or a family member with you to have that conversation. If that's not going to work, that's when you really should contact your state elder abuse or seniors rights service. They can have those conversations. They can help you figure out how to communicate that with your child, and they might be able to do things like write a strongly worded letter outlining what you want and the consequences if they don't, those sorts of things. There is dispute mediation, but obviously that's not really going to work. Perhaps if it's come to this, they're not necessarily going to engage. And that's when it might come down to the child's behaviour or circumstance. If they're being violent or abusive towards you and harmful, then there might be grounds for an intervention order, like if you were being harmed or fearing for your safety. And in that circumstance, you know, an intervention order might say that they need to leave the home or can't be within a certain distance of you. And if they breach that, then police would be able to remove them from the house, which, you know, that is a possibility. So but the short answer also is it's very hard. It's not an easy thing to have to do.
And is there any age that you can do this from? And would it vary state to state, territory to territory? Would you have to wait for your son or daughter, or, you know, your child to be over a certain age?
Well, definitely it's a different circumstance if your child is under 18. Yeah, I'm not going to speak directly to that, because that's kind of a whole different raft of issues of the supports and things that your child might need and what that circumstance is. So that would be applying to adult children. Yeah.
I don't think we're talking about children, but yes, that's a really tricky situation, and one that we know that so many older people are affected by. Look, I would like to open it up to the panel to just maybe wrap up here and to give your final comments of what you'd really like people to take away from this session on family agreements. So if I could ask you, Rachel, what would be your big message to everyone today?
Well, my big message can sort of answer a question that I just saw in the chat a moment ago, because it's 3% of the participants in our prevalence study that entered family agreements, not financial agreements, family agreements. So that's the prevalence of these estimated in the population. So my takeaway message is that from the National Elder Abuse Prevalence Study, we can say that these agreements are uncommon, and that there unfortunately is an association or a correlation between having a family agreement and elder abuse. But we're of the view that this is likely to be as related to the socioeconomic status and reflective of relationship dynamics as much as it might be related to the uptake of a family agreement. So my caution would be receive independent legal and financial advice early before entering into an agreement, and to think about, you know, as Melanie said earlier, I think that's a really great piece of advice. What do you want? You know, what is it that you want in an agreement, and is it what's best for you?
Thank you. And Eileen.
Okay. Look, basically, my takeaways are, you know, as you probably expect, to you know, get financial and legal advice, and also to document. And I'd also just like to raise the issue of, in many cases, this is an access to justice issue. Like, I'm kind of saying here, oh yes, go off and see a solicitor and so on and so forth. But the thing is, I mean, number one, you know, solicitors can be expensive. Number two, sometimes people are concerned about taking that step, and there's some fabulous references in the chat box. And so really, you know, think about your CLCs, and think about, you know, the seniors' rights organisations in your states where you can get affordable advice. And if I can say one sort of thing, with a budget coming up and an election coming, we really need more affordable legal advice supported by social workers and other experienced people in the field that is affordable to older people. There simply aren't enough of those services at the moment, and the ones that are here and doing very good work are overloaded. So we need more. for better access for justice, we need more funding. There, I've said it.
Well, let's start the campaign. It's a very good year to be campaigning for better access to justice. And we've just had something in the chat box about the Commonwealth Attorney General's website, but it's really that face-to-face conversation with someone that can give you that legal advice, and community legal centres are getting a good rap here, as well as a whole range of other services, because if you don't protect yourself, who is going to protect yourself? And you've got to go in to something like this where you're giving away your livelihood or transferring your livelihood. You've really got to maybe just look into that, and step by step. No ambushes at Christmas or Easter or other family events or big birthday parties. That this is something you've got to step through and go quietly and avail yourself of all the facts and all the safeguards for the sake of everyone. Now, Melanie, what would you like to say to wrap up?
Well, similar to what the other panelists have said, I think the most important thing is to have those conversations. Talk about it, talk about it, talk about it to friends, to family. Make sure everyone in the family knows what you're considering, what the options might be. Everyone can kind of have an opinion. You might sort of think that's awkward, or it's very difficult to talk about the things that might go wrong, but it's not as difficult as those things actually going wrong and then trying to sort it out afterwards. So really have those conversations. Make sure everyone knows what you're thinking about. If someone's pressuring you to do it and doesn't want you to mention it to other people, that's a big red flag. So really make sure you're open with what you're doing and you're getting as many perspectives as possible, and think about, is this what I want?
Yeah, keeping it a secret or making a snap decision, wanting a decision in a hurry, are big red flags, aren't they? Really?
That's right. Take your time. Yep.
Take your time. Someone on the chat box said it's like taking out insurance, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. But look, a very big thank you. We've had wonderful, hugely experienced panelists. A very big thank you to Professor Eileen Webb, Dr. Rachel Carson, and Melanie Yostin. It's been great also to have the people of Compass put on this event, and for all the work they've done to make this a reality. Compass is a national website navigating elder abuse in Australia. Compass aims to create a national focus on elder abuse by raising awareness of this growing social issue, and to simplify the process of connecting people to services and information tackling elder abuse. Compass has been created by Elder Abuse Action Australia, that's EAAA, with funding from the Australian Attorney General's Department, which is, and Compass, the website www.compass.info is a hugely helpful resource, and they'll be sending out some more resources to you in coming days or the next week. Just some helpful tips that can get you along your way, get you thinking. A great resource, something to have at your fingertips. Elder Abuse Action Australia is the national voice for action to eliminate elder abuse through systemic advocacy and policy development, best practice and research and education and capacity building. EAAA is a specialist organisation with knowledge of issues that impact older people and their families, communities, and broader society. EAAA's board represents advocacy groups and individuals who are strong advocates on elder abuse in their jurisdictions. Now, don't forget, have your pen and paper handy, and it's the Elder Helpline. That's 1-800-353-374. That's 1-800-353-374. Thank you for coming along today. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, and all the very best.